Europe enters 2026 struggling to find its footing with the Global South.
Forget Geneva. The world's new peacemakers are in the Global South.
From Western centrism to Global South, developing countries unite to push for a more just order.
In a multipolar world, the Global South finds its moment.
Good morning. We have the privilege today to have a discussion with Professor Christoph Frei. Christoph Frei is a political scientist and expert in the history of political ideas and international relations. He studied political science and earned his doctorate in 1933 with a dissertation on Hans Morgenthau. And I think it is important because Hans Morgenthau was a promoter of political realism. From 1994 to 1996, he served as a personal advisor to the then Federal Councillor Kurt Vogler, before returning to academia with teaching appointments at several universities, including Andrássy University in Budapest. Since 2005, he held the position of Professor for the History of Political Ideas and International Relations at the University of St. Gallen. He retired in 2004, marking the occasion with a final lecture attended by more than 600 people, underscoring the impact and dedication he brought in his academic career. We are very happy that we can now have an interview with Professor Frei.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. For a long time, the global order was shaped by a relatively small group, first of European and then joined by the US and Japan, and which was labeled Western powers. Today, the center of gravity is clearly shifting. Countries such as India, parts of Africa, the ASEAN countries, and beyond are forming their own alignments and their own future and interests, and are no longer just reacting to Western initiatives, but shaping the agenda themselves. Where do you think we are right now in this transition, and what kind of, maybe not world order, but world balance or world cooperation is beginning to emerge from it?
That's one big and interesting question and challenging question already. It is perhaps a good idea to look back for 1 second before we look where we are now. If we go back just 100 years, we in the West and in Europe in particular, we were the masters of the world. At the time, some 100 years ago, there were only like 60 sovereign states, and the rest of the world, they were all colonies. And so today, of course, everything has changed. We're now looking at roughly 200 sovereign states. And the one petrifying number here is that 2/3 of all existing states in the world were born after World War II. And so to come back now to your question, it is only natural in so many ways that former colonies, that these societies would now turn from objects of our history to subjects of their own history. And so before we go on, let me just say to what extent I think the process itself is natural, and the process itself is also necessary, because if terms such as equity or fairness mean something to us beyond the rhetoric, I guess we need to embrace the process, even though it is very uncomfortable for many of us. Now, where are we today? And here I would simply say that, Antonio Gramsci comes to mind, an Italian Marxist who 100 years ago in prison wrote, "The old order has or is dying, but the new one has not been born as yet. And so in many ways, we are in this transition between the old order that we're all familiar with and that new emerging one where we don't quite see yet what the contours, what the format of it will actually be. And that's why uncertainty is so prevalent today, and uncertainty replacing certainties of days past.
Thank you. And this brings us actually to the question, how are, let's say, the old powers, let's say Europe, the US, etc., reacting to that, because it is a new challenge. You know, for 40 years ago, the G7 was created, and it was still an important factor. It was actually the US, Canada, Japan, and the four major European industrialized countries, and they were a major factor. I don't think that the G7 has still a big importance. Now there are new organizations like the G20, which were created, but which are probably not so not so effective. So the question is really, how does Europe and the US react to this new challenge, to this new situation?
It is probably not a big surprise that those who used to be so very much in charge and those who used to be the masters of the world, it is probably not a surprise to see them resist as best they can. They find it very hard to embrace change. They find it very hard to adjust to a new world where China, India, Brazil, Nigeria, and so many other societies stand up and speak in their own right and speak for their own interests. So I guess the overall attitude is one of stemming the tide. We try to hold it back rather than embrace that kind of change. And again, I think it's very, very natural. But it's equally natural that from the other side, the push will not, end. I always like it when Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, comes to the United Nations in September, telling everybody in front of the General Assembly that the current world order is clearly too Western in design, and that it needs to change so as to include more of the norms, values, standards of other societies. And he is right. But why did we never bother to even notice? Well, because it was our world, our standards, our values, and we had absolutely no reason to even ask those questions. But again, today these questions are being asked, and I think it's a good thing. It's a natural thing. It is a necessary process.
That's, this is interesting, and I think it is very natural and very logically. But if we jump now even more to Europe, that Europe is no longer in the position to shape and create world orders, yet it still sees itself as a regulatory superpower with the mission to put more norms and self-created values on the world. In many countries, this regulatory overreach is seen as another form of land grab and neocolonialism. However, this reach and setting of norm lacks credibility, probably due to the lack of power, and sometimes also to make it an overreach and doesn't make so much sense. Now, Europe is no longer a colonial power in the classical sense, yet it often speaks with the language of values, norms, and regulations. At the same time, Global politics is increasingly shaped by interest, power balances, and hard capabilities. Also, to come back to Morgenthau's political realism.
Absolutely. I much agree with how you put it, Prince Michael. It's the world that we are familiar with in Europe, the world that we have grown so fond of, is literally crumbling before our eyes. And that is a world where interests, hard power replaces soft power. And how do you then adjust in a matter of a few years to something that has become alien to you? Because let us not forget, and I think it is only fair to remind all of us to what extent we have relied upon the US Americans to produce public goods, such as security, open trade lanes, sea lanes, a stable financial system, respect for international law on the part of the many, not the Americans themselves, but many others were pushed to respect the rules of the game. And so, under such and rules-based order, the Europeans would excel. They would build, as you put it, a regulatory superpower, which is not nothing. But if the currency of power changes and hard capabilities, hard power, military capabilities come back. And, we now see what it means for the Europeans to be threatened by the American president these days, that we're actually being threatened, that they will use capabilities that we have, that we simply don't have. So we fall from heaven. We literally fall from heaven and are pushed out of paradise, so to speak, because this is a world that we are not familiar with any longer. And then the challenge now is to adapt, to grow up in terms of security and security policies, to grow up, become mature. But gosh, that is a huge challenge after so many years in paradise. So, in so many ways, the 64 million question is: shall we live up to the challenge in Europe? Are we going to be able to muster the political will um, amongst 27 states within the European Union? And let us not forget, there are a few other states, as we know, beyond the European Union. So, how to produce collective security without the Americans? That is the challenge that we're looking at. And how to be turned into an actor that will be able to move and maneuver in the world where regulatory power is definitely put in proportions and where military and hard power comes to the fore.
When you are talking about security, I think we have to give some credit there to President Trump that he's waking Europe up.
Absolutely.
I think this is certainly to his credit. But let's go to the other side. How do the emerging powers perceive Europe today? And we still talk sometimes a bit patronizing about the global south, which is not very good because 80% of the population of the so-called global south lives north of the equator. And actually, the Russians were more realistic than we since 30 years. They call it the global majority.
Mm-hmm.
And how does now the global majority see Europe in this play? And I have the impression that there is no clear view either that is it still a big power? Is it not a big power? What is their role? I think it's quite interesting also to observe what is the perception in the majority of the world.
A very wonderful and a very healthy question. Why? Because the answer puts up a mirror. And I feel like we should look into that mirror much more often than we actually do. So the contrast between how we perceive ourselves as still being at the center of the world, if not the center of the universe, everyone else cannot but emulate European institutions. Everyone else cannot but admire and follow suit. But the fact is that the rest of the world, in what we so unfittingly call the global south, they look upon us with very different eyes. What they see is a society that really has a very sweet life. Make no mistake about that. Soft power wise, we are still there. People want and they see the life that we have. But, and here comes the big but, they see us as well-meaning but naive. They see us as, and I quote a friend in Lebanon, where I take master students to Lebanon to look at migration and look at what a migration crisis looks like. But to come back to the question, they see us as tree-hugging people, meaning well, speaking softly, but being naive, lacking the will even to walk the talk. They also see us as extremely hypocritical. Look at the European reactions to the war in Ukraine. Look at the European reactions to Vladimir Putin's war of aggression. And then look at European reactions to the war in the Middle East, to the war in Gaza, the fifth war in Gaza. And so, looking at Europe from the outside kind of gives you a rather different perspective than, looking at us from where we are, of course, with all our biographical luggage on our shoulders. So, yes, two entirely different perceptions. And again, I think that we should, since we call ourselves an open society, we should be much more interested in how others solve their problems and how others do things, and actually learn something that we have unlearned, and that is be open and learn from others. But where we are, I think we're still too saturated, too prosperous, too wealthy, and too fat to even bother about how others, look at things, do things, and solve problems.
I think that many actions of many emerging powers are often interpreted here in Europe as a rejection of Western values. Aren't these countries in reality acting with growing self-confidence and are increasingly willing to question Western norms, institutions, and rules that not longer necessarily align with their interests or reflect today's more pluralistic distribution of power? Is this a misreading rather than rejecting a specific ideology or confronting the West as such? Are these countries primarily acting in a pragmatic way, seeking to diversify their risk, to preserve autonomy in a world where no single power can guarantee stability anymore?
Yeah, again, I couldn't agree more. In so many ways, they have to be pragmatic. The societies of the global south cannot afford the luxury to cling on to one or the other superpower. They cultivate equidistance towards China, towards Russia, towards the United States, because they cannot afford to, or they think it's unwise and imprudent to join one camp, as it were, at the price of alienating all other poles. So They have to be pragmatic. And concerning values, I'm not so sure whether they actually are against our values. I think leaders in the global south, they just see that we are very ambivalent, that we are hypocritical, that we have double standards in so many ways, that we don't quite live up to the values that we preach. So, you know, compromising over values is impossible. But, and here comes a core tenet of political realism, Kissinger, Niebuhr, Morgenthau, interests can always be mediated. You can always compromise on interests and find a middle ground. And so these countries, to as best or from what I see, many of these societies actually want to compromise. They want to deal with us. They want to engage. They want to really, really work. But what they don't want any longer is the preaching, the arrogance. What they don't want is the condescending kind of behavior that we have demonstrated all too often in the past. So in the end, quite frankly, I see the challenge on our side as much as I see it on the other side. We need to adopt our modes of thinking, and we need to adopt the way we look unto others. We need to really learn to see them at eye level and deal with other societies at eye level rather than continuing to show them what they should do.
Yes, and I think I can remember I was once, but that's a long time ago, 40 years ago, no, 30, 35 years ago, I was discussing with certain Israeli politicians. And they said to me, these problems in the Middle East will be solved soon. People in the Arab countries, they look at the American movies, they have genes, etc. They will adapt to the Western culture, and that will mean peace in the Middle East. But I think this is a bit of arrogance as we had in Europe and in the US, that people want to have our culture and our necessarily our way of life. And I think we have neglected a bit that these countries have other traditions, other cultures, which will also be part of their governance system, so that the governance system cannot be one-to-one transfer from one region in the world to the other.
I agree. I think I would perhaps put it in proportion. I think people everywhere in the world, people like a good pair of blue jeans, or people like the comfort, the material comfort that Western culture has developed. At the same time, of course, you are very, very right in reminding us that it's a selective takeover. To some extent, the world has been westernized when we look at the material, the technological, and even some of the cultural aspects. But it is also a fact that these societies come with their own traditions and they don't want to sacrifice them. So they're selective in the takeover. China is a wonderful example. India is a good example. Nigeria, so many Western elements there, but people, and rightly so, have their own traditions and they have their own way of doing things. We here in Appenzell, we don't like for others to tell us how we should do things. We don't like that at all. And I think we need to respect that other societies don't like to be taught too often, that other societies want to find their own way into modernity. And that's actually is how it should be.
Yeah. Maybe to wrap a little bit up what we have and look a bit in the future, where would you see certain promising areas, what Europe could do in order to ameliorate and to make successful their interaction with the global majority, with the African countries, with India, with the ASEAN countries, and thus also regain part of the, let's say, respect and appreciation, which is actually challenged at the moment.
Hmm. I'm, if it weren't utterly naive on my part to say so, I would say open up those markets, let them in, let them. We're the world champions of protectionism in so many ways here in Europe, and above all here in Switzerland. We certainly know how to protect markets. So it is probably a naive thing to remind all of us that free trade would allow so many other societies to deal with us at eye level, to actually be partners rather than receivers of foreign aid and so forth. So, but then there are areas where I think Europe really has something to has something on offer. For many of these societies, climate change, for example, is not about values, it's not about ideology. Climate change is an energy problem, is an industrialization problem, is a concern of food and water. And so where we, with the knowledge and the capabilities that we have, I think we would have something on offer in terms of climate-centered partnerships with many of these societies. That being said, I come back to free trade agreements, bilateral or multilateral. I guess that would be a wonderful thing to actually, or a wonderful avenue to walk down, to pursue. But again, there is a big but. Look at Mercosur. We speak of a free trade agreement with Mercosur, and then we don't even manage to stay unified. The European Parliament, now comes up and tells us that we need to review the whole thing with the European Court of Justice. So again, it's in so many ways the problem lies on or the challenge really lies on our end. We need to walk the talk and seize those opportunities that are out there in so many ways. The future really does not need to be a bleak one. It comes with so many opportunities for trade, investment, and so forth. But I think we on our side need to do our share, stay unified, stop preaching, start walking the talk, and compromise on interests rather than preaching values.
I think this is a very good end. Thank you very much. And it actually tells to us to be a bit more pragmatic. Still, we don't have to give up all the values, but we have to apply that in a more pragmatic way and also see how the view of the other side is and not just our side. Thank you very much for this interview. And I wish you all a good day. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of Unconventional Knowledge, a podcast from Geopolitical Intelligence Services. Thank you for listening. New episodes are released on the first Monday of every month, so subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to stay updated. For more analysis on global affairs with a detailed focus on future scenarios, visit gisreportsonline.com. And if you'd like to explore how any of the trends discussed today could affect your business or industry, email us at advisory@gis.li for a consultation or a custom report. We'll see you next month.